So thank you for joining in. And what I will do is we'll start with the Moodle first, because I want to show you a couple of things in terms of this particular course. Now, I know that Simone and Kate, both of you have joined for the award first, because as I mentioned, I think I've spoken to both of you initially as well. This is a nested qualification. So what we want to do is finish the award, say before the end of February. And then for those of you, I think Kate wants to go to a certificate, which will mean you'll need to do additional units. And then it also leads to a diploma. I think the only bit that we recommend, why I suggested that you start with the award, is that it has only got 2 units. And these 2 units essentially mean that you do not need to document or provide any sort of a work experience or working within a nursery or within a setup which requires you to show that you're working with as a practitioner for early years or working in childcare in particular. So when we look at the award side of things, it has got 2 units, unit 1 and 2, which are mandatory. The first unit is child development from conception to 7 years. And then when we look at the second unit, we are essentially focused on looking at understanding children's health and well-being. Now, these 2 units add up to, I think, about 12 credits in particular. And these units are graded. So you'll be able to get a grade A, and D is a pass, but you also have grades like A plus, A minus, B plus, B minus, and then C, and then C minus, and D is a minimum pass. Now, what I also want to draw your attention towards in this, what I've opened up, is a learner handbook. But here, what I want to essentially show 2 documents which are important. And this table, which is on the page 15, which basically shows that for a certificate and a diploma, you need to be able to document these many number of hours that you're able to evidence that you're working with in a particular environment. And that would mean you would then be eligible to do a certificate or a diploma. So generally speaking, if you're working with nascent, newborn children in particular, then you're looking at for certificate 25 hours, diploma 25 hours. But if you, as you go up in terms of the age, if you're working with, say, children between the age of 5 to 7, in nursery, you need to document 40 hours, and for diploma, 60 hours. So this is a bit that we need to ensure that there is placement or there is evidence of work available for you to be able to start studying for a certificate oblique diploma. The award has no such placement requirement. That is the reason why I've started you off with the award. Now, if you go down to page 17, it basically explains unit 1 and unit 2, which are mandatory for the award. As you can see, these 2 here. And then for certificate, these 2 units will remain, but you'll end up doing additional units, and similarly for diploma. So on the diploma, there are 14 units. On the certificate, there are 9. And on the award, there are 2. Now, what I would also want to do at this stage would be to go into a bit of quick detail in terms of how we'd be looking at covering the units. Now, when we normally teach live, what we are looking at doing is covering each of the learning outcomes in one of the sessions. These sessions would last between 25 to 30 minutes, 40, 45 minutes, depending on how we interact and obviously how good the sessions are going in terms of interaction and your understanding. So generally speaking, for each unit, we'll be looking at a number of lectures. These lectures would typically be basis the learning outcomes. So when we start unit 1 today, in a couple of minutes, just after the introduction, what we are looking at is we are going to be looking at lectures for unit 1, which will be child development from conception to 7 years. This unit we'll cover in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lectures. So the 6th lecture that we're going to do in terms of the Zoom lecture is going to be a discussion on the assignment in terms of how you're going to go about actually creating the evidence for the assignment. So generally speaking, for unit 1, we'll be looking at about 6 lectures. There'll be a bit of a self-study that I would recommend that you do, and I'll show you the resources that you need to look at apart from the presentations. There'll be some handouts that I'll upload, which have been gleaned from the books, and they would provide you summarized and filtered information to be able to cover some part of the content given in, the learning outcome 1 across various assessment criteria. Now, similarly, when we go to unit 2, we are going to be looking at covering that particular unit. Okay, let me just mention one other thing while I'm at unit 1. Now, when you look at the unit 1, there is, and as I mentioned, these units are graded. What you're also going to look at is when we look at the units, there are certain assessment criteria which are on the grid. which will be, if I go back into the unit spec, if you see here, it says learning outcome 4. There are 3 assessment criteria in that: 4.1, 4.2, 4.3. Now, these assessment criteria that you see here on this side are actually linked to how the assessment and grades are awarded on the qualification. So it is not going to be a case down to me that, Kate or Simone are my favorite students and I would like to give them the best possible grade. This is something which has been made quite clinical by the awarding organization, and you would be able to see what tasks that you attempt are actually adding to what grades on your overall unit. And that is something that you are able to see in the grading criteria, which I'm just scrolling down, and that is the Unit 1 assessment grading criteria. So when you see tasks 1.1, 1.3, 2.1, 2.2, 5.1, they are minimum required for you to pass this unit. So these tasks will be carrying a grade D, and D is the minimum pass required for this unit. Now, when you start doing other tasks like 1.2, which is in learning outcome 1, 4.1 will be in 4, learning outcome 4. These would be C criteria. That means if you do all the Ds, which is mandatory, and all the Cs, then you are kind of putting yourself into a position wherein you are going to be overall getting a grade C for this particular unit. Now, if you start doing tasks 3.1 and 3.2, along with all the other tasks that you've done, you are going to set yourself up to be able to achieve a grade B. And then if you do all the assessment criteria given here, then you are going to be setting yourself to achieve the grade A or A star, which will be applicable for this particular unit. Now, why is this important? Sometimes I have learners, what they do is they will be just interested in getting a pass and going through the qualification. So what they do is they go into the assessment criteria, grading criteria part of it. And what then they do is essentially just look at bare minimum tasks which are required to be done to help them get through the unit and achieve a pass. So they will just do the D task, and that would mean that you pass that unit. You do a bit of less work because you're attempting less of the assessment criteria, and your assignments are shorter. So obviously, because of the time that you spend, you are only able to achieve grade D. Now, one of the other things which is important in this is why I'm showing this to you is that if you do not attempt all the tasks which are given in the assignment brief, then what will happen is we won't be able to give you the feedback to help you achieve a higher grade. Sometimes what happens is that you would go ahead and answer all these tasks. But sometimes what happens is when you compile the evidence, you might have not given enough evidence, or it might need a bit of change, which needs to be done to make it meeting the criteria of the unit. Then in those cases, depending on the tasks that you've done, we are able to give you feedback. So if you do not do or attempt the task, we won't be encouraging you to go to a higher grade. So it works in the same concept. If you don't ask, you don't get. Similarly here, if you don't attempt the higher grade tasks, which are A, Bs, and Cs, then you won't get the feedback on that. And that would mean that you'll be defaulting to a minimum pass grade. So is that something which is understood? Is that something which you understood? That is what I want to, also check with you, that what I'm explaining is being understood at your end. So
Yes.
okay, so in certain qualifications which are graded, the feedback from the assessors or the center can only be to the fact that you are attempting those tasks, and on those basis we can give you feedback. But if you do not attempt, then we won't be able to give you feedback on these tasks. That is why it is important. So what is the takeaway from what I've explained here is, thank you, both of you have understood. The takeaway is that irrespective of your knowledge, research, and the evidence that you put together, my suggestion would be to go across and attempt all the tasks that are given in the assignment brief, so that if you even fall short of the evidence which is required for those tasks, then I, as a teacher, would be able to give you feedback. This feedback is going to be directive, and that feedback will clearly tell you that you need to add this or refer to this or include an example or include this theory. And when you include that and you submit it back, that hopefully should allow you to attempt and achieve that particular criteria, thereby helping you to achieve a higher grade on the unit. So these two documents which these two documents which I mentioned are very important, for the 2 units that you're going to study. The reason why I want to show and talk about this at the start is so that you're very clearly aware where these 2 documents are. One of them is an assignment brief, which is given at the end of the unit 1, and the other is assessment criteria for unit 1. Similarly, when you go to unit 2, it'll be unit 2 and assessment criteria. So these 2 documents are bits that you need to be, aware of. Now, the assignment briefs are a typical assignment brief from the awarding body, wherein it is a task and it's like a question. You have to write it down and you have to answer the question which has been given. So it is going to be a case of choosing the task, writing it down on the Word document, and then starting to explain the evidence underneath that task. So it is a question answer based assignment, nothing in terms of a case study or and a research or a reflective statement. I think the 2 mandatory units, there is a lot of content to cover, and that's why what they've done is they've broken it down into bullet points. And if I was in your shoes and I was looking at talking about any of these points, then what I would essentially do is basically write the task down completely, and then underneath that start creating the evidence. We'll come to this when we discuss the assignment brief and the assignment session. But for now, what I want to obviously drive your attention towards is primarily the bit in terms of how you would basically look at the sessions, and how we are going to look at some stage discussing the content, and then what would be the additional reading material that you would need to look at from a point of view of the presentation, and obviously understanding some parts of it that we are going to discuss. So that bit on Moodle, what you see currently is just the presentations, the course handbook, maybe the assignment brief, but I'm going to start adding documents here after each session, along with the recording that we will have for the session, so that if you need to revisit or go through it again, you would have that option available. And these handouts that I'm going to add are primarily going to be handouts which are going to be either activities or handouts giving you further information into what we are looking at discussing. Now, with this, what we will do is basically get into our first unit, which we want to start off with discussion. And in that first unit, we are looking at basically the first learning outcome when we talk about, the child development from conception to the, 7 years. So let me shift you over to the presentation slide. And I'm going to also discuss a bit of very briefly, today being the first session. So basically discuss a bit of this let's put it this way, give you a bit of a background into the unit and obviously why this is important. So one of the things that, what we look at is when we do talk about child development from conception to 7 years, why is this unit quite important? I think one of the things that you would look at in the qualification that you're doing, which is, childcare in particular and education, what we are looking at is you getting into, so this could be, a question, let's say the question that you might have in your mind when you would have started, but some of you might have had a bit of an example, relevance to it, why that you want to study this particular qualification. So from my point of view, people who are looking at studying this qualification are looking at, obviously getting first-hand experience of working with young children. And because this is a qualification in early years, what we are looking at is from age groups from a newborn baby to the age group of 7 years. And for those who are already working within this sector, this qualification can obviously open new doors, and new career opportunities specifically for working in different sectors within the education. And I would say early years in particular, in various, I would say, fields that could include care, nurseries, schools in primary education, in after day school clubs that we normally tend to have, and in general working around or working with young children which are sometimes in foster care or obviously need care because of their disabilities or in terms sometimes right abilities. And at this age, children need to be given the right guidance, and the guidance comes from childcare workers who essentially have gone through this qualification and have understood why it is important at the early years to be able to ensure that children are able to get the basics of basic skills which are required for them to become successful individuals at a later stage. And what you're going to be looking at doing is basically when you go through this particular award of early years, we are looking at basically you gaining knowledge and learning in order to understand how children develop in the early years of their growth. Specifically, when we talk about from birth to nurseries, going up to the school in the first year, or when we look at obviously children stepping into nursery or kindergarten education as we call it. So here's some of the excellent practices that you need to be aware of as a worker who works with the young children or children in the early years. Should be aware of some of the basics of how to deal with children. And when we look at this particular term that you will come across a number of times when we discuss in our sessions, and this term is going to be EYFS, and this term is going to be early years of foundation stage, which is basically a mandatory and a statutory framework which the government has now put into place. And this particular framework in the UK sets standards for early years providers, nurseries, daycare centers, primary education schools, nurseries, and in certain other setups where children essentially are, or earlier providers are essentially required to ensure that learning and development of children happens between the age group of 1 year to 7 years. And this framework, which has been established as EYFS, is important because this promotes learning and development of a child in the early years of its growth, when they are coming up, and from their birth stage to the early years of their growth. And some of the key areas that you're going to be looking at understanding is that this has become a statutory framework which basically requires anybody working with young children to be able to implement and adhere to, because this is something which has been made mandatory by the government, and it focuses on children being able to develop in the early years things like communication, the language that they are able to speak, the communication skills they are able to pick up, how to develop personal, social, and emotional skills, and how do they look at how do children essentially and workers or practitioners which are essentially working with young children understand that there's an emotional development also involved as an aspect when children are growing up in the early years. Obviously, the physical development side of things does happen with children because they are growing, and it is important at this stage for the children or children within this age group of 0 to 7 to understand what is and start developing skills which will help them build their literacy, numeracy, which is maths, and general understanding of the world around us, and they are able to express themselves, and that is what is covered under the early years foundation framework or the EYFS stage. Now, this unit that we are going to be studying, as I mentioned to you, is an important unit because when you look at essentially child development, which happens from conception to the age of 7, it's a very complex and a dynamic process. And the reason I say that is because it encompasses various stages through which the child actually, sees their growth happening. And in order to ensure that the growth of the child is in line with helping it to develop cognitive skills, numeracy skills, expressing skills, and basic social, personal and emotional skills, which overall aid in the physical development of the child, are important. And that is what we're going to be studying in this particular unit when we talk about, child development from conception to the age of year 7 or 7 years. Now, this particular unit that we're going to study is primarily going to be looking into understanding how child development happens, when we talk about physical, cognitive, emotional, and social changes which the child will undergo in terms of its growth that the children is having essentially. And this is going to be influenced by a number of factors, and these factors would include genetic factors, essentially environmental influences and experiences which children are able to get both from within the family, outside the family, and the extended family, or the environment in which they interact. Now, there are a couple of theoretical frameworks that we are going to be looking at studying. So we're going to be looking at understanding the growth of, when I say growth, I mean child development essentially. And these frameworks that we are going to study, I'm going to try and provide some handouts to you, which are going to be summary handouts. These would include Piaget's cognitive development theory, Erikson's psychosocial development theory. We'll have the Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, and we'll also look at the attachment theory. Now, these are basic theories that are linked. Obviously, there are generic theories which are, coming from the field of psychology and in general used in other areas as well. But what we're going to be looking at is the usage of these four theories in particular and how they can relate to the development of cognitive, physical, emotional, and social skills within children when they are growing from the age of 0 to 7. And that's the whole essence of this particular unit that we're going to be looking at when we study different learning outcomes and understand the various stages through which children go through when we talk about development of children from conception to birth, and then from birth onwards till the age of 7. And that is what we'll break it down and then study into different learning outcomes, seeing let's say, the growth of the child across these years by reading this particular unit. Is that okay? Is that understood? Any questions on this so far?
Yes.
So feel free to ask me any questions at any given stage. If there are things, if I'm going too fast, or obviously if there are things that need a bit of clarification. So in today's session, we are going to be looking at learning outcome 1, which basically talks about development from conception to birth, and there are 2 assessment criteria. Now, let's look at one of the first thing that I want to do is understand how the development of child happens. So we will need to start with, for example, at this moment, look at talking about conception. So typically, when you look at how a child is conceived, after the conception has happened, you would have some important stages in pregnancy. And these important stages would typically be when you say, for example, when mothers essentially look at a positive test, what they tend to do is there is a period during the initial weeks where you see the implantation of the fetus happening within the womb of the mother. And in those cases, those 12 weeks are quite important. So what you generally see is that in the first 12 weeks, the fetus after the conception is going to get formed, and that would, the zygote, the biological term is zygote, which is where the zygote then gets implanted or attached to the uterine wall of the mother's vagina or womb. And that is where the developmental side of the pregnancy then starts to begin. So when you normally hear people become ladies or females, when they become pregnant, the first few weeks are very critical. Sometimes you would see the doctors prescribe a medication called Pregnacare or some sort of a tablet, which essentially allows in let's put it this way, the development of the zygote to happen, and it also basically helps the implantation of the zygote to happen in the uterine wall. Sometimes we also see and hear that there could be a miscarriage. That is when after the conception, the pregnancy does not hold, or in this case, let's put it this way, what I would say is the fetus, which gets formed in the first 4 to 6 weeks, does not get attached to the uterine wall, and it passes through the system, and you have a miscarriage. So in those cases, in order to avoid that, normally GPs would prescribe some sort of a medication initially to ensure that this does not happen. Now, when you're planning, obviously a baby, there are these things which are given to you as advice by the NHS, and obviously when you see your GP, and those are the bits which are important to ensure that you are prepared and you're making some initial bit of preparations from a bodily aspect to ensure that you are able to then, conceive that baby. Now, after the first 12 weeks, when this let's put it this way, after the 12 weeks, when the zygote and the zygote is developed into a fetus, the zygote is basically a cell, and this rapid multiplication of that cell essentially then goes through a phase wherein the fetus gets formed. And in 12 weeks, what you'll generally see is some sort of a small replica of a baby in some shape or form is available, and that starts to develop and grow. And in the first 12 weeks, what you'll also see is that the nutrient side of things, which are going to come, to the baby or the fetus in this case, the umbilical cord gets attached to to the mother's, wall, and that starts to then provide nutrients. And obviously, anything that the baby eats or, poops out, all will go through that particular tube, and that is going to provide nutrients and obviously, nutrition essentially for the baby to be able to grow. So when we look at the important stages of pregnancy, first would be conception, the formation of zygote, the first 12 weeks of the development of a baby, which is wherein the fetus gets implanted into the uterine wall, and then it starts to grow. Now, between the 12 and the 24 weeks, the growth which the fetus experiences can be a bit variable. That means, depending on the diet, depending on the conditions that the mother has, you would generally see the growth of the fetus happening within the body. And that is when you have, when the GP normally recommends a scan after 12 weeks or after 24 weeks, up to 24 weeks, and there's a scan that you go in and get done, and that scan allows you to see how the baby is growing. And at some stage, even during the scan, the radiologist can actually determine the sex of the baby as well, whether it's a boy or whether they see a bottom or they see a willy. They are able to even predict, and you normally get a scan at the end of that, you get a print of that scan at the end of that appointment, which gets to show that, okay, the pregnancy is, or the fetus is developing well, the pregnancy is holding, and things are moving forward. And at some stage during 32 to 37 weeks, when the gestation period ends, you would generally see the baby being fully formed, and at that point in time, the process of delivery essentially starts. So one of the first stages that we need to understand in development of children, it says from conception to birth, and that's the first stage that we need to understand in terms of understanding the important stages of, pregnancy. So they begin from the stages which are termed as, germinal. First stage would be the conception stage. Second would be the germinal stage. The germinal stage is the first 2 weeks, where you would generally see after the conception, the zygote essentially forms and it undergoes rapid cell division. And that stage is generally the germinal stage. So here, there is some sort of a cell or a blastocyst which gets formed, and that would try and, attach itself to the wall or the uterine wall of the mother's womb. Then at some stage, when between the germinal stage and when we get to see the fetus, that stage is called the embryonic stage. And this embryonic stage would essentially be the 3rd week to the 8th week of pregnancy, wherein you would generally see major organs of the fetus being formed and systems begin to form within the human body, or in this case, the body of the fetus. And a neural tube, including brain and spinal cord, would be formed. And the 4th stage that we normally talk about is the fetal stage. And this fetal stage would essentially be the 9th week onwards until it continues and we have the delivery of the baby, which is the time of, let's say the delivery of the baby at 36 months, 36 weeks or 37 weeks. And in those cases, you would generally see all the major organs being formed, all the systems working, the growth and refinement of body structures, including bones, brain, spinal cord, or limbs and facial features, etc. All that would have happened. And then when we divide, one of the other ways that you would generally see is that when we look at dividing the pregnancy into various phases, these phases are called trimesters. So you have the first trimester, you have the second trimester, and you have the third trimester. So the first one is consisting of your conception, germinal stage, embryonic stage, second one, the fetal stage, and the third one towards the stage wherein you are preparing for delivery of the baby. And that is when you would primarily be looking at dividing this into 13, 13, and 13 or 12 weeks, depending on, sometimes you have late deliveries and early deliveries. So that's why the time period varies between 37 to 42 weeks. But the average is generally about 38 to 40 weeks. That is what the science tells us, and obviously what we have generally seen. So these semesters that you are going to see, which primarily would be looking at how GPs, pediatricians, nurses, which work in the triage, essentially would be looking at monitoring the pregnancy and how it is progressing. And obviously, in some cases, you are asked to do some tests, get some scans done. They would be at these three different trimesters, first 12 to 13 weeks, then 24 weeks, and then towards the end, when they check the dilation of the vagina to see whether the baby's, the head, because the baby turns fully, and what they would normally tend to see is whether the baby's head is oriented towards the pelvis, so it can have a natural delivery, or in some cases, if this umbilical cord gets coiled around the baby's body and the baby is not able to turn and the head is not towards the pelvis position, then in these cases, you would generally have a C-section, and that would need a consultant and obviously a surgery, and the baby is delivered through the C-section, or as it is called, the cesarean section. So these tend to be the three trimesters that we normally see in terms of the baby developing from conception to the birth stage. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
No, that's good.
Yeah, it's fine, fine. This one's fine.
Now, obviously, because some of the slides are developed as if you were doing this session in the class, so that is where I'm going to be providing these additional handouts for you to be able to go through and basically relate to what I've explained as far as the first part of the conception to the birth is concerned. Now, what I'm going to try and see is if I can get hold of a video, conception to the birth stage, and just generally see how you would normally have this happening. So there's a nice video from National Geographic that we can have a quick look at, which is a short video.
Simplify your search for healthcare. Your Boots pharmacist will see.
Let me just see if I can show this video to you. And that's the bit which we would look at very briefly.
But none of which may be quite so incredible as the development of life.
Right, okay, that's the video which I want to show you. Just give me 1 second. Let me share my screen. So let's look at this particular video without a bit of marketing jargon. So are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Over 3 million babies are born each year in the United States alone. Worldwide, the highest fertility rate is found in Niger, where the average woman gives birth to approximately 6.49 children in her lifetime. Singapore sits on the opposite end of the spectrum at just 0.83, less than 1 birth per woman. While the number of births, customs, and traditions vary from culture to culture, the developmental process is essentially universal. Derived from the Latin word pregnantem, meaning before birth, pregnancy is the period in which the fetus develops inside the womb. Typically lasting around 40 weeks, human pregnancies are divided into 3 trimesters of 3 months each. Pregnancy begins in the uterus, where a sperm fertilizes an egg. If the sperm carries an X chromosome, the baby will become female, while a Y chromosome will result in the baby becoming male. The fertilized egg, or zygote, divides repeatedly as it travels through the fallopian tube, implanting itself on the uterine wall to form both the embryo or a specialized organ known as the placenta. Found only in eutherian or placental mammals, the placenta will manage waste and provide key nutrients, oxygen, and hormones via the umbilical cord. The brain, which will continue to grow and develop throughout the pregnancy, makes up nearly half of the embryo in these early stages. As the eyes, nose, ears, and mouth, along with all major organs, continue to develop in month 3, the baby will begin to look more and more human with each passing day. The second trimester lasts from weeks 13 to 27. The fetus will more than double in size during this time, and soon its movements may be felt by the mother. Hearing first develops around week 18, but the fetus will not respond to sounds outside of the womb until approximately week 25. Starting at week 28 and lasting up until delivery, the third trimester is a time for final touches such as eyelashes and taste buds. With most major development complete, the fetus will gain nearly half a pound a week. To make room for this rapid growth, the mother's internal organs adjust significantly throughout the pregnancy. Dropping lower into the pelvis, a fetus typically turns heads down in preparation for birth. Most bones will have hardened by this time, though the skull will remain relatively soft to ease the delivery process. Labor is divided into stages, beginning with the dilation of the cervix and resulting in the delivery of both the baby and the placenta. Despite thousands of years of human pregnancies, scientific understanding has only recently begun to catch up, leading to an increase in success and safety for both mother and child. As our understanding of pregnancy continues to develop, so do technology and reproductive medicine, with much more in store for the future of pregnancy.
So basically in this video, as you can see, what I covered is shown, I would say, visually. And I hope you were able to relate to what we discussed in terms of, from conception to, conception to pregnancy. And then obviously we'll be discussing, further stages. So this bit is important because what we need to understand is how long it lasts, how it happens. Obviously, there are chromosomes involved, and the sex of the baby is determined whether the sperm carries the X or the Y chromosome. And then at some stage, what we are going to look at is the baby being born. And when we look at the baby being born at some stage, what it will allow us to understand is that the first part that we looked at in terms of the pregnancy will then transform into what is called the antenatal developmental checks. Now, these checks are primarily going to be done, by the nurse. And these checks that are going to be done are primarily going to ensure that, that the parents are ready to provide the care which is required to receive the baby. There are a series of medical and, healthcare appointments which the, parents would normally go through in specific, the ladies who are basically bearing the pregnancy. And what they're going to do is assess whether the pregnancy is going to be maintained. Is it going to lead to any complications? Is it going to, in some cases, some of the, if medical healthcare professionals essentially feel that the pregnancy is not going well, they would also be taking out the amniophloatic fluid, which is to test the baby for any deformities which are developing, if any sort of development is not to happen. And that is the reason why normally during the trimesters, regular scans are, recommended to check if the baby is growing, and is showing the usual signs of growth within the, mother's womb. Now, these checks are very essential at this stage to monitor the health and well-being of both the mother and the child. In this case, we call it the fetus, because from the week 12 to week 36 till the baby is born, we're going to refer it to as the word fetus. Now, These antenatal developmental checks are essentially done to ensure that both the mother and the baby are fine. The baby is showing, or in this case, the fetus is actually showing the right signs of growth in terms of body organs and vital, organs required for the baby to be able to function when the delivery happens. And the main goal at this stage, is to look at monitoring the health of the pregnant woman, and also to ensure that there is, the environment around the mother in particular is conducive enough for the fetus to develop in a healthy, in a proficient manner. So here, all the necessary guidance and support would be provided to the mother essentially, or the pregnant woman essentially, to ensure that the fetus is developing as per the growth and the development of fetus. As in the video, it mentioned that after the 24th week, the fetus puts on half a pound of weight every day, and that is to help in the proper growth and generation of organs and some of the vital functions and systems in the body of the fetus. Now, there are going to be obviously checks which are going to be involved. These checks are going to be involved at the GP's end, at the midwife's end, and these checks would basically also in some cases involve physical examination. And the physical examination would be to check signs of any wear and tear which are happening essentially. And in those cases, then suitable advice or medication would be provided so that there is no infection or any such serious infections happen both with the pregnant women and also with the children. There are obviously, classes that women are recommended to do before the delivery happens, but regular checks also ensure that, things like maintaining a good diet, a good hygiene, and these, along with the regular checks and advice is given to ensure that, you have regular checkups and visits with the GP or the doctor, and it is to check and thoroughly ensure that, there is nothing in the harm's way for both the baby which is developing or the fetus, and in this case, the mother who's obviously carrying the pregnancy. Now, one of the main things that I want to discuss is to look at understanding, if it is from experience or in general, if you've read and heard about it, what could be the various antenatal checks which the pregnant woman has to go through when they visit, say, for example, the GP or the midwife. Can you think of any tests which the mother has to go through when we talk about GP visits, or visits with the visits from the midwife, which typically happen to your house? Any ideas on that?
Well, I know with when I was pregnant, I had tests to check what my blood type was. I had to. They obviously measured the baby every single time. They checked your vitamin levels. They check your urine output and any impurities in the urine, that sort of thing. Was a lot that I went through, and they check your weight and your blood pressure and all that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So that's a good point. So for those of us who have probably gone through this as a process, what you would generally see is that normally ladies are recommended to get through some tests, and these tests tend to happen pretty frequently, especially when you are when you are pregnant, and they tend to include things like your vital body scans or body tests, which include blood tests, urine tests, stool tests. It would also include tests in terms of your hemoglobin in particular, because because you're not just requiring nutrition for yourself, but there will be a baby which will be growing inside you, and for that obviously you would need to have nutrition which is going to be enough. So sometimes you would also look at the blood test, looking into the red blood count and also the white blood count, and also looking at iron and hemoglobin in your tests. And these are predominantly done to ensure that if you're anemic, say for example, there are certain times when individuals require iron transfusion, or in some cases your diet needs to be regulated to be able to say for example regulated. And in those cases, these tests would be useful because they would inform the medical team and the healthcare professionals essentially to take necessary steps that would be required to ensure both the wellness and well-being of the mother and the developing fetus. So in this case, sometimes you're also recommended to go in for an ultrasound or a test, which is, to look at getting a scan of the baby and how the fetus is actually growing. And one of the terms that I mentioned earlier, sometimes if the medical and health professionals are able to pick up that the fetus is not growing as planned and it's not growing in terms of what the usual growth patterns are during the pregnancy period, then in those cases, even tests, the amniocentesis fluid is, taken out using from the placenta, a slight bit of it, and that is then tested to check, for any medical abnormalities which the child might develop. And in some cases, or in extreme cases, I would put it this way, that medical and healthcare professionals also look at recommending a termination of pregnancy, because that would mean that the child is, or the fetus in this case, is developing with abnormalities which could be genetic, or which could be, abnormalities which would limit, in some cases, the duration of the lifespan of the child when the fetus is or the baby is born. So these tests are important essentially, and these tests generally tend to happen when you visit the midwife, or when you have visits from the midwife, or essentially visit the GP, or you see a consultant. Now, these bits would be covered in the antenatal development checks, which is to see how the growth is happening from the conception stage to the delivery stage. Now, if we wear the hat on and say, now the pregnancy has gone well, everything is fine, it is, I've had the delivery of the baby, and what we then need to look at is basically postnatal care. That means once the baby has been delivered, what we will need to then look at is series of tests or conditions under which the midwives, and in some cases the triage team, which consists of a healthcare worker, a nurse, and a midwife, essentially would be looking after the mother who has had a delivery, and they will look onto and obviously provide conducive environment for the child to be able to, the parents to be able to then take the child home. So in such cases, when we talk about postnatal care, what we are looking at is basically the critical aspect of healthcare that focuses on ensuring that after the delivery has happened, both the well-being of the mother and the newborn baby is ensured. And it encompasses a range of, medical, emotional, and social support services which are provided either through the midwife, health visitors coming to your home, and in some cases, sometimes the baby and the mother are kept under observation for a day or two at the hospital to ensure that they are able to have a smooth recovery. So in some cases, if the delivery has happened through a C-section, then generally, in order for the stitches and other things to heal, you're normally recommended, and you're put under supervision, and you're not discharged for the first 3 or 4 days till you're showing signs of smooth recovery, from a point of view of the mother in particular. And then certain times for people who are first-time parents, there will be a lot of different, let's say, coaching and training being given to and make you understand how to breastfeed the baby, or in some cases, how to help in the growth and development, or the initial 40 days, which are essential, the first month, which is essential for the baby's growth to happen, and for parents in general to be able to understand how they need to be able to take care of the baby from the stage when the baby has been delivered to the stage wherein the baby, starts to become normal. Because the first few weeks for the baby are also critical, because the baby has a lot of things, and the system and the organs start to function. And what you generally see is when you have babies, the first few weeks, the baby poops, the poops are normally dark in color, dark green in color, quite smelly, is because the baby is excreting out all the extra bits which are in the body when it was feeding through the placental tube within the mother's womb. And then its systems are slowly and gradually taking over to be able to self-sustain that particular growth. So things like checking of your weight, urine test, blood pressure, and in terms of checks, whether you're able to feed the baby and is the baby getting enough nutrition. All those things are essentially done when we talk about postnatal care. So postnatal care refers to medical, emotional, and social support, which is primarily provided to the mother and the newborn in the immediate weeks of the baby being delivered, from the childbirth stage perspective. And this part is quite vital when we talk about, how the mother and the baby are going to recover and then are going to, develop, or mothers obviously they'll go back to doing their routine work, but children are able to, or babies in this case, are able to develop, and they get the adequate facilities to be able to develop, and then start growing, because the growth phase of it is normally monitored by the healthcare workers, the medical health professionals in the postnatal care. So sometimes this is also called the maternal care, because you'll have, if you've had a complicated delivery, or in some cases, if there were complications during delivery, then the maternal care would continue after even you have got discharged from the hospital. And that typically tends to happen at home, when you get visits from the healthcare workers and nurses to be able to check on you periodically and the baby, to see whether you're able to, whether you're reviving and obviously, recuperating and getting better and getting back to normal. So that part of the care which is provided would be termed as what is called postnatal care. In some cases, this will also involve physical health assessment to check that you are a physical thorough examination to see whether you're recovering from the delivery in terms of your monitoring of vital signs, like your incision sites. For example, if you've had any cut or tear during the pregnancy, then those have they fully healed. If you've had a cesarean section, in those cases it is looked at specifically the surgical wounds, or the surgery stitches are being, you are recovering from them. And in some cases, the uterine wall, your uterine wall is also looked at for involution, which is basically to see that there are no more, placentas or zygotes which are implanted, and a thorough inspection of the uterine wall is done to ensure there are no more other developing pregnancies in this case. And that is to ensure that the mother is able to then get back to her normal routine. Now, there would be other things which will also be involved in postnatal care, and they would mean that the baby might need to get some initial vaccination. And these initial vaccinations typically tend to be rubella vaccinations or BCG vaccinations in different countries, polio vaccination in certain Asian countries when polio is still present. But in the UK, polio and some of the other vaccines like smallpox, they've been totally eradicated. So there is no mandatory requirement for this particular vaccine, but there are additional, vaccines which are given to the baby at the newborn and after 12 weeks or after 24 weeks. And those tend to be mandatory vaccinations to help develop immunity against certain known diseases or known, illnesses that they need to get, so that they are able to develop immunity at the very young age as they're growing as a child. Now, all this part forms the postnatal care. This would also include things like getting the mother to get some support on or training, because there are lots of classes that you're given and recommended to go to, things like breastfeeding, how to hold a baby, in terms of, taking care of the baby, in terms of putting the baby into a push car, checking it out, changing nappies. Lots of this support essentially tends to come from healthcare workers, which are a part of the family planning. And then you're also given advice on contraception and other aspects of family planning, which will all be a part of postnatal care, which will either be delivered through a healthcare worker, through a midwife, or in some cases, nurses giving you knowledge and information about, so that you're able to make well-informed decisions. And just after pregnancy, then follow through in some of these cases to get back to normal or begin a normal life. So postnatal care tends to be the most comprehensive healthcare approach that supports the development of the child and the mother by providing physical, emotional, and social well-being to both the newborn children and the mother. And this is grounded in the fact that you would normally have these visits coming from the midwives, the nurse, the triage team in terms of the nurse and the healthcare workers to ensure that you are both recovering and the child is growing healthily, and there are no psychological, traumas or any such influences which you go through. And if you do so, then in those cases, relevant support is provided. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
No,
Nice.
that's all good.
Now, when we look at this particular part, we also then go into, looking at understanding what are the first few years of life looking like. So when we talk about the first few years of the life looking like, we would basically be looking at a newborn baby. And there are a number of observations which are basically recommended, by the midwives and the, health visitors and your GP. And they typically look at, asking you to maintain certain vital signs of how you are going to track the growth of the baby. Sometimes you would see that during some of the classes that you're recommended to go as parents, both the father and the mother, you're normally given a lot of extensive documentation, leaflets, flyers, and they are to basically do and bring yourself up to in terms of education of how you would bring up the child. Now, a couple of things that are important in those cases are typically birth charts, scales, or certain ideas in terms of infections or diseases or illnesses which the children can pick up easily. You are given information on that. One of the main things that you look at is basically the APGAR score. This is one of the vital things or observations which describe the condition of the newborn infant. That is to see what is the condition or the, say, I'll give you a practical example. When babies are born, what you normally do is the nurses or the midwives will essentially give the baby a quick wash, and after that, or sponging, and after that, what they normally do is weigh the baby. They would check for vital signs, things like are the eyes opening up, is the baby able to breathe? They will tap the baby or slap the baby 3-4 times to see if the baby cries. And those things would generally be looked at from a point of view of um, ensuring that there are these vital signs which the baby is showing. They will normally tickle the baby's feet to see if there are movements happening. They will stretch the arm, open the arm like this, and basically see whether anything is. They will pick up basically signs of what you want to see in a normal baby or a baby born with, I would say, all sorts of aspects. So generally, a chart in this case is maintained. And this particular chart, which is called the APGAR chart, stands for activity, pulse, grim face, appearance, and respiration. These are the 5 vital signs which are essentially noted by the midwife when they deliver the baby. And they would see activity, whether the child is blinking, crying, flagging their hands and feet, or kicking. They will look at the pulse rate of the child. They will also look at the grim face, which is to see whether there is any sort of response to stimulation when they tickle, when they pinch. Does the baby cry? Appearance wise, they will look at whether the baby is looking blue face, pale face, red face. And then they will also look at the respiration, which is basically to see whether the baby is breathing, and is the breathing normal, not normal. And those are the signs that would be picked up at some point in time. Now, this tends to be what is called the APGAR scoring system. And this system is very vital because it is maintained primarily from the ages of 0 to 16. And that would also then have things like your height, the number of the teeth or the tooth that you have. So some of the basic bits that we know are a part of the developmental process would be essentially looked at. Things like observation of limbs and head. So sometimes you would see the nurses count the number of fingers, count the number of this, and this is all a part and parcel of noting down the basic features of the children by making an observation. And these observations typically tend to happen around the stool. We would see the changing color of the stool after the baby is born, to 3 weeks, 6 weeks, and then up to 8 weeks to 10 weeks. The stools then become normal in color, which is golden brown. They'll turn color from, they'll change the color from dark musky green to golden brown, and that would show that the organs and other bits have started to function normally. within the baby. And nurses in particular look at these signs in the newborn because they're quite familiar with it. And when they look at something isn't right, they need to bring it to the highlight of the pediatrician, and in this case, the consultant, and that would then require a proper evaluation or a proper re-evaluation to be done, so that it is looking at ensuring that the baby is born with no abnormalities or essentially any defects. And that is why the first signs that they look at putting the baby through is to look at an APGAR score, and this score generally tends to be a score of 7, which is an average. And this is done in a 5-10 minute check, which the midwife or the nurse would do after the baby has been born. Now, there are a number of tests which are performed, by the nurse and the healthcare professionals. One of them is called the Q3 test. Now, this test is performed on the 7th-day, and this is to detect phenylketonuria and cystic fibrosis. So normally what happens in this particular test is that the heel is pricked and a sample of blood is taken, and then the blood sample is analyzed to essentially look for signs of what is called the Q3, or in other words, it's called the heel prick. And this test basically detects any serious genetic conditions the child may develop after the birth has happened. The second test that we look at is what is called the Barlow's test. And the Barlow's test is primarily done by the midwife and then by the pediatrician. And this Barlow's test, or the Ortolani test, as it is also called, is basically done to check the, I'll put it this way, this particular check is essentially done to check for hip dislocation or dysplexia. Now, this test is repeated by the health visitor and GP in 6 weeks in order to ensure that there are no dysplexia or hip-related issues present within the baby. Because sometimes during delivery, what you will normally see is that when the baby is born, the baby's body is quite pale and quite soft. So when the baby is delivered, sometimes the baby's body is turned and twisted. The baby's body is turned and twisted, and in order to ensure that there is no deformity in terms of the bone, in particular during dislocation, this particular test looks at ensuring that there is no dislocation of bones specifically in the hip areas, which happens within the baby. And that would mean that this part is then taken care of. Now, in the early years, or the first year of the child being born, the first year from birth to the first year when the child attains, normally in England, what you'll see is there is a personal child health record, PCHR, which is kept. It's a red colored book, which normally is maintained. Color might not be relevant, but there is a book which is normally maintained, and this red color book is often as I mentioned, I can recall, so I didn't read that, but it is also called the Red Book, and it is because it maintains all the personal, all the records of the child from the time of birth till the child turns 1 year. Now, this book will essentially help track the progress of the baby, and this progress of the baby is going to be then shared with the team in general. So, for example, the GP surgery, the consultants, the pediatrics, and the nurse, which basically takes care of the child and obviously provides support during the first 3 to 4 months when the mother and the child are actually growing. So you'll have these regular visits which happen, height, weight of the body of the baby is measured, and it is noted down in this particular, some of these vital signs are actually noted down in the book. This also Red Book contains the key baby's immunization, which typically tend to happen after the birth, and these immunizations are noted down, whether you've had the first dose, the second dose, and in some cases, noting down if, for example, the parents are from outside the UK, then in some cases, parents, the children of those parents, because they come from outside the UK, and some of the let's say the disease and illness are not present in the UK, but they, because of genetics side of things, you're recommended to have certain immunizations or vaccinations, and those are then administered, and they are all noted down in the book. Now, what we need to do at this stage is look at what is called a centile chart. Have you heard about what is called a centile chart? Any idea in terms of what
No.
is a centile chart? Okay, I'll bring across a centile chart on the on this slide. What I would want to do is, so this is an example of a centile chart. Now there are two parts of this particular chart, two types. One is a chart which is predominantly for boys, and the other is a chart which is predominantly for girls. So the one in red is for girls and one in blue is for boys. Now what tends to happen is in the red book, I don't know, because I've been a parent and I can relate to this. In the red book, there is a page, or there's a section in the book wherein this particular chart is there. Now this centile chart is essentially used to measure, and plot or chart the physical growth patterns that you get to see, which is happening in the in the baby. So when I look at the centile chart, essentially what you will see is there's a normal pattern, and there is a, so what the healthcare visitors and the GP and the midwives and nurses are looking at is whether the growth and development of the baby in the first year, from birth to first year, is happening or is falling between the variance which is identified as normal. And the normal variance tends to be between 0.4 to 99.6. So if that growth is happening within that, if the growth activity of the child, which is showing the activity in terms of its growth and development of the body and the limbs and arms, is happening within that particular, for boys and girls, it's slightly different. But as long as it's happening within that variance, this allows them to be not very concerned, because this is showing that the baby is growing normally. But if the growth is outside this, it could show that if it is low on the lower side, it'll be showing it is unusually low. If it's on the higher side, it'll show that it's the baby is experiencing, or the body is experiencing, high growth. So when we talk about centiles, these tend to be, the average growth tends to be between 0.4 centile. And if we do see anything over, let's say anything over a certain ratio, which is defined both for weight and the length in terms of how the body is growing, you would generally say that it's either low or it's on the higher side. And this is again to keep track of, say, for example, the vital signs of the baby in terms of the growth which is happening in the first few years. And this helps, and this is something that you have to physically draw, and measurements are done periodically. So what you do is these measurements typically happen from 0 to 12 months, 12 to 24 months, and in some cases 0 to 36 months. So this chart that you would draw will actually describe the pattern of growth that the healthy children usually follow, and whether they are being breastfed or they are being fed through a formula, or in some cases then this chart would help compare this to let's say babies of the same age group, but looking at certain other variable parameters. For example, if the baby is being breastfed, if the baby is being say, for example, I'll put it this way, there are 2-3 things that you look at, and that would allow the medical and health professionals to pick out any abnormalities or any underlying healthcare issues which they would want to spot. And that is why this particular chart is essentially maintained. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
Yes, fine.
No. So when we look at the third part, which is quite important, is when we look at some part of immunization happening with newborn babies. So when I look at the immunization part of it, what we are looking at is understanding what is the schedule which the newborn baby would go from from delivery to the stage of 12 months, up to a first year. Now, generally, there is a routine of vaccination which is normally followed within the UK. And this routine of vaccination which babies need to undergo or take under the age of 1 would typically happen at a certain periodic period. Now, this particular vaccination schedule, if I put it this way, if I draw up a quick slide and I look at the NHS vaccination schedule in terms of what this schedule is for babies. So when we look at 0 to 8 weeks, there are 6 vaccines. There is rotavirus, there is MenB vaccine, which the babies need to get. When we look at up to 12 weeks, you're looking at 3 different types of other vaccines, second doses. These 3 vaccines, you would particularly have what is called the second dose of these vaccines being given. And then at 16 weeks, you'd have only MenB vaccines dose being given. So if I put this particular chart on, which you can see on the slide, you'll be seeing that, when we talk about the 6-in-1 vaccine, the 6-in-1 vaccine essentially, would be a vaccine which consists of vaccine which includes let's say medication, which basically is given through the vaccination route. It includes for diphtheria, for hepatitis B, it includes HIP or Haemophilus influenza virus vaccine against that. You look at polio, tetanus, and whooping cough. So this 6-in-1 vaccine is given as the first dose in 8 weeks. Then you have the rota vaccine or rotavirus vaccine, which is normally given. And then you have the MenB vaccine, which is normally given. And these 3 vaccines typically tend to be the first vaccines which, babies would get when they are 8 weeks old. Rotavirus vaccine is normally an infection which is caused through diarrhea, and it leads to vomiting and diarrhea in the baby. So this, in order to prevent this viral infection, rotavirus vaccines are normally given. And when we talk about MenB, we are talking about meningococcal group B bacteria, which is an infection which is caused by this particular meningococcus bacteria. And that bacteria basically, affects the stomach. So it doesn't allow, the food to settle, and it leads to, serious issues in terms of, septicism or meningitis. And this tends to be an infection which basically happens, through the MenB, virus or meningitis and septicis virus. And this can affect the brain and the spinal cord. So I don't know if you recall, a couple of years back, there was a mention of Zika virus or a mosquito called Zika mosquito. If it bites the mother, when the mother is carrying the baby during pregnancy, you would normally have the child or children being born with mental, deformalities. So in such cases, when we look at these vaccines, they are quite important to be given to the children in the first 8 weeks. 12 weeks routine tends to be a repeat of second dose of some of these vaccines. But in the 12th week, you would also see the pneumococcal vaccine being given, which is, again, the first dose typically provided, or the only dose which is typically provided to protect against a certain type of bacterial infections. And they can cause, infections or serious illnesses like pneumonia, and they would be given in the 12 weeks. And in 16 weeks, the third dose of the 6-in-1 vaccine and the MenB vaccine is given, and they tend to be the first bit of vaccinations which children get in the first year of their growth. And that would be, although there are other vaccinations which children get, when they become 1 year old to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, 3 to 12 years, or in some cases, beyond 14 years. So we'll study that as we go along in the learning outcomes. But what we need to know at this stage is that there are 3 different, periods through which the vaccination happens, and that would be at 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and 16 weeks. And these vaccinations tend to help the child develop immunity against certain bacterial as well as viral infections, and they are important to be administered in the initial, stages of the child going after birth, from pregnancy to birth, which is from birth till the age of 1. And that would be the third part that we look at in terms of growth when we talk from conception to birth. and from birth to first year. So antenatal, prenatal, and immunization. Any questions on this so far?
No, it's fine. I already read before, so I know a bit.
Good stuff. So what we did in today's session is to basically look at, understanding the early stages of development from fertilization to the end of gestation, which is when the baby is born after pregnancy. And what we've looked at is some basic aspects of the three parts that are normally vital checks, which are the three, that are done normally after the baby is born up until the first year. So antenatal, postnatal, and the immunization part, which is what we need to understand for the first learning outcome. Now, in addition to this, what I'm going to do is obviously provide you some theoretical frameworks, as I mentioned to you earlier, which will be related to understanding, some of the important, say, theories which are related to development or child development, essentially. And they would be the Piaget's cognitive development theory, Erikson's, psychosocial development theory, Vygotsky's social cultural theory, and the attachment theory. So those will be the 4 handouts that you will see, which will come up on Moodle very shortly after this session. And then I think what we've done is we've planned these sessions for tomorrow as well. And what we're going to do is catch up tomorrow, same time, and hopefully on time at my end. And then we'll discuss learning outcome 2 for this particular unit.
No problem.
Good stuff. So I will, if there are no more questions at this stage, I would primarily end the session, and I will catch up with you tomorrow. And a copy of this recording and the session will also be made available on the WhatsApp as well as on Moodle just shortly after I close.
Okay, see you tomorrow.
See ya. Thank you. Thanks for joining. Bye.